Hi kids, do you like violence? Well, today we're going to talk about some people who don't like violence, and they are pacifists. Yeah, we're going to look at pacifist approaches to war. We've looked at just war theory, we've looked at what the Bible says, and now we're going to look at pacifism. So, for this lesson, all I want you to do is get some paper and just make notes. So, just make notes on the things I ask you to write down. So, this is our title: How can we evaluate whether pacifism is effective and morally right? So, we're going to look at those two things. Is it morally right to say we can never go to war? Is that a good thing? And is it effective? Does it actually work? Or that, because that's often the criticism given to pacifism, that it doesn't work. It would lead to terrible consequences if we became pacifists. First thing I want you to do, so when you've got that title down, I want you to write down the following quotes and just explain what they mean. First one is a quote from Gandhi. Gandhi is not a Christian, so this wouldn't be a Christian point of view. He was a Hindu. He was a pacifist. And he said this, he said, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." Though he wasn't a Christian, he was talking about a teaching from the Bible here. The teaching of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth in the Bible. So I want you to write that quote down, write that it's from Gandhi, and explain underneath what it means. What he's trying to say here is an eye for an eye. If we've practiced an eye for an eye, if every time someone was violent, we took violent revenge on them, it would end up with everyone being damaged. So, if every time someone was killed, we killed someone, and if every time someone killed someone, they were killed in return, and then that side would take retaliation, and that side would take retaliation again and again and again, everyone would die. So he doesn't literally talking about blindness, but he's saying if we take revenge every time something bad happens, then we'll end up with everybody in the world being damaged. It will never stop. So that's one quote for pacifism. Here's another quote: "Thou shalt not kill." Exodus 20:13, nice and simple. In the Bible it says not to kill. There is some discussion about whether that should be translated as "don't kill" or "don't murder." But for some people it's just "don't kill," and therefore war is always wrong. Next one we talked about before: "If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." That's from Matthew 5:39. In the New Testament, that's Jesus that says that. This is probably the best quote to use in favour of pacifism from a Christian point of view, because it's directly saying even if you're attacked, you should not retaliate with violence. So it seems to be a fairly strong Christian reason to be a pacifist. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. So if someone hits you, let them hit you again on the other side of the face. Do not fight back. Do not retaliate. So there's some quotes that you can use from a pacifist point of view. Okay, once you've got those quotes, and you need to have written those quotes down and explained why they might make someone a pacifist, I want you to write down these two definitions. There are two kinds of pacifism. There is absolute pacifism, which is the belief, that's people who believe that violence is never acceptable in any situation. So that's really what I always think of as pacifism, absolute pacifism. Violence is never right. A conditional pacifism are people who believe that war is wrong, but in some situations it might be the lesser of two evils. So in other words, a conditional pacifist would be against war, think it's wrong, but think that, well, in some situations we can allow it because it will be even worse not to go to war. So, for example, just war theory could be seen as an example of conditional pacifism, because just war theory says that usually it's wrong to go to war, but if there are these certain circumstances, there's a good cause and it's the last resort and you don't injure civilians, then you can go to war. So that's conditional pacifism. And mainly we're going to be talking about absolute pacifism today, because most people, I guess, are conditional pacifists. Most people believe that war is usually wrong. So we're mainly talking about absolute pacifists. So write those two definitions down, please. You also need to give some examples of people who are pacifists. And I'm going to give you two groups of Christians who are usually pacifist, and just write their names down. It might be worth saying something about the approach to pacifism they take as well, because they're a little bit different. So the first one are the Quakers. Quakers are a form of liberal Christianity. You find they come originally from this country, but you find them in many different parts of the world. Quaker are generally pacifists. They're famous in many ways because I've got the sign of the Quaker porridge oats there, and Quakers owned many famous businesses in the past. So they were started by Quakers. So Quaker porridge oats, Cadbury's chocolate, Fry's chocolate, Barclays Bank. A lot of big businesses have been started by Quakers. The reason for that was that when Quakers began, it was a time when you had to be a member of the Church of England to be part of the major professions, doctors and lawyers and all these kind of things. To be one of to have that kind of job, you had to be part of the Church of England. So Quakers tended to go for jobs or make their money in ways that were different to that. And one way that you can to do that is to make your own money through business. So that's why quite a lot of Quakers were in business. And that's just not really relevant for what we're talking about today. But Quakers are pacifists, and what's interesting about Quakers is they're quite their form of pacifism often involves doing things. So they would protest against wars, for example. You'll still see it today. If there's an anti-war protest, there'll often be Quakers marching in that protest with banners and signs talking about being against war. So Quakers are anti-war, and they also do quite a lot to protest against war. So they're quite, in a weird way, they're quite active pacifists. They do quite a lot to protest against war. Next one, someone we looked at before, the Amish. The Amish are quite different. Obviously, Amish are a group who are mainly today in the United States of America. And Amish are pacifists, but they are not involved in protesting. The difference is that Quakers believe in trying to bring about the world that God wants throughout the whole world. So in other words, they're trying to actively make the whole world into the sort of world that God wants. That's what Quakers are doing. So that's where they go out and try to persuade people. Amish people are more concerned with making the kind of world that God wants just within their community, and their idea is that they should just separate themselves from the rest of society and create the sort of world that God wants within their own community. So for that reason, they're not really interested in persuading other people. They're just thinking, we will have a peaceful society where we are, within our community, and if people are going to war outside of that community, that's up to them. We're not going to try and protest against it. So that's the difference between Quakers who are out there trying to stop war and Amish people who are not really interested in trying to stop war. Okay, here's another key term you need. Conscientious objectors. So conscientious objector, just write this definition down. A conscientious objector is someone who will not fight in a war, even if it's the law that they must. So, during the World Wars, that's First World War and the Second World War, we had conscription. People were forced to sign up to the army. And in that time, some people would refuse to sign up. Many Quakers were involved in this. They would not sign up to the army. And there would be punishments if you weren't signed up. You could be arrested. In some cases, very, very strict punishments for those who are arrested and punished for being conscientious objectors. So a conscientious objector is someone who, in a situation where there's war and where people are forced to sign up to the army, they refuse to sign up and they take whatever punishment they're given. It's worth saying that in many cases, Quakers who would not fight in the war, they might still play some part in the war. For example, they might agree to go to the front line and work as medics or stretcher bearers, something that didn't involve fighting. So it doesn't mean that because someone's a pacifist, it doesn't mean that they will not get involved in that war in any way. As long as they're not fighting, they might get involved. Next slide. Okay, I want you to put this down as a short subheading. How can we fight for justice without violence? So you've got this question, right? The Quaker would be asked would be, well, okay, you're against violence, but how are we going to fight against bad stuff in the world? How are we going to fight for justice? How are we going to challenge things that are wrong without using violence? Are there any other ways you can do it? Well, yes, there are several other ways. How effective they are is another question, but there are other ways. So I've got some pictures here. At the top left of your screen, you've got as we go through this, can you just write down some examples under your heading? So the top left there, you've got a protest march. Protest march against the war in Iraq. Bottom left there was a similar thing that happened in India with Gandhi. That's Gandhi in that picture. He led a protest march. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But both, you can put that down as one example. Both of them are places where people just march through the streets saying that they disagree with something. So marching. You can have boycotts. I've put on the top right there, don't buy South African goods. So that was protests that we had in this country and in many different countries during that apartheid era when South Africa was a racist country to protest about it. Some people decided they weren't going to buy goods that were produced in South Africa. They weren't going to give any money to the people of that country until they changed their racist policies. So boycotts. You might also be aware of in the civil rights movement in America, the movement for rights for Black people. When Rosa Parks was made her protest against the policy of where she could sit on a bus, Martin Luther King led a policy of boycotting the buses. So people refused to use the buses until the bus company changed their policy. A more extreme example on the bottom right-hand side is you can see an example of self-immolation. That is a Buddhist monk in Vietnam who has set himself on fire. Always gets a bit of a shocked reaction, this. But that has happened in a number of occasions where people have publicly used very extreme actions like that, but against themselves rather than against their enemies, to kind of shock the world into understanding about the problem. So this was someone complaining about the treatment of the Vietnamese people under a particular government. This is before the Vietnam War. And this monk felt like the world wasn't the reason he thought that it would be better to get justice for people in Vietnam if the world's attention was brought to how terrible things were in that country for people. So he sat in a meditation pose and set himself on fire. He died, but his idea was that it was worth doing it to bring the world's attention. It certainly did. That photo became very famous. It's debatable whether that is a non-violent form of reaction, because some people might say, well, it's violent. It's just violence towards oneself rather than other people. Back to the Salt March, which is the bottom left. The Salt March is an example not just of marching, but also of what's called civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, which would be a good one to write down, is where people break laws which they think are unjust. They don't do it violently, they just break them. And if they're arrested for it, they don't protest against being arrested. The whole point is to break the law, to get arrested. And the idea is that by being arrested, you bring people's attention to how unjust this law is. So for Gandhi, they brought in these laws. So Gandhi was mainly protesting against the British rule over India. So he was from India, and at the time when he lived, the British were ruling over India. India was a colony of Britain. And not only was that unfair in itself, but many of the ways in which the British treated people within India was unfair. One of the laws which he was against was the laws about salt. So basically they brought in rules about who could produce salt. The whole idea was so that companies, usually British-owned companies who produced salt, which obviously salt is something that like everyone needs, so there's a lot of money in producing salt. They made rules so that only those people were allowed to make salt. That normal Indian people couldn't create salt. And this is it seems like it's quite a significant thing because it's a lot of money is based on it, but also it's quite a kind of strange thing when you think about it, because it's really easy to make salt. You could just go into the sea, if you live next to the sea, get some seawater, it's got salt in it, evaporate the water and you've got salt. But you're not allowed to do it because they've brought in a law saying only these companies can produce salt. So what Gandhi and his followers did is they went down to a sea, they made salt, and then they got arrested. Often they were beaten up by soldiers or by the police and put into prison. The whole idea was to show people that what these people were doing was wrong. Civil disobedience. You break the law, but the whole idea is to bring people's attention. Look, we're doing something very normal. We're going to the sea, we evaporate this water, we make salt, and we're getting beaten up for it. How can that be right? So there's a few ways we can fight justice without using violence. Marches, boycotts, civil disobedience, that example of self-immolation or people setting themselves on fire. You can think of many others. You could have petitions. Petitions is when you get people to sign their names to something, and when you get a certain, the more people get signed up, the more pressure there is to change things. So there's a few ways to fight for justice without using violence. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is something to do with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a Christian minister. He was born in the USA in 1929. It's often forgotten that his main job was a Christian minister. You know, he was a leader of the civil rights movement, the rights of black people in America. But his number one job was he was a preacher. He was a minister at a church. A minister is a kind of another word for a priest or a vicar. So he led the civil rights movement, which tried to bring equality for black people. And this is the quote I want you to have down. So I just want you to quote, really. Make sure you have a note. This is from Martin Luther King. He said, "Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral." So if you can write that quote down, we're just going to look at the two things he means. Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. So he's talking about violence, using any kind of violence or war or whatever it is, to achieve racial justice. That just means fairness amongst black and white people. So he is saying that using violence to achieve equality between black and white people is impractical and immoral. Now let's just take one word at a time and make sure you have notes on what this quote means underneath. The reason I've put those two words in different colours is because I want to say something about each one. So immoral, first of all, by immoral he just means it's ethically wrong. So he's basically saying it's wrong to use violence. And as a Christian, he's probably going to look there at things like the turn of the cheek. Jesus saying it's wrong to fight back. So he was just basically saying there, it's wrong. It doesn't that if it's immoral, that would mean it doesn't matter if it's effective or not effective. It's wrong. But impractical is an interesting one. So impractical means it doesn't work. It's not effective. So he is saying it wouldn't be effective to use violence. And this is a more interesting point, I think, because many people might agree, well, yeah, it's not really good to use violence. It's ethically wrong. But some people might think, yeah, but surely it's the only way to, sometimes it's the only way to get good results. But he's saying, no, it doesn't bring good results. Now, what I usually do if we were here in the lesson is to watch a clip from the film Selma. This picture on the board. On the slide, sorry. Usually in a lesson I would watch a clip from this film and we'd talk about it. It's quite an effective clip. So if you have access to that film, try and watch that clip. I think it's, I don't know, like an hour or so in. But I'll just talk you through what happened. So Selma is a film about Martin Luther King and about sort of the protests he did. The protests that took place in a town called Selma. And in Selma, what was happening was that black people weren't being given the right to vote. Now, at that time, black people actually legally had the right to vote, so they were allowed to vote. But what was happening was that black people were being kind of stopped from voting by unfair policies about when people tried to register to vote. So there's a scene in the film where this black woman tries to register to vote, and you have to do like a little interview to be able to be registered. And they would ask her ridiculous questions like, can you name every judge in the whole of this state? Well, it'd be like, I don't know, 60 or 70 judges you'd have to name. So they would use these kind of policies, these tests, to stop black people from registering to vote. And the idea was that they wouldn't have given the same test to a white person and just let that white person register. So Martin Luther King wanted to protest this and make sure that black people had the right to vote. Obviously, it's extremely important to have the right to vote because if you want to change the laws and bring in equality for black people, one way to do that is to make sure black people can vote in elections and vote out the people who are prejudiced against them. So what Martin Luther King did was organise a series of peaceful protests, and one of the protests, which is documented on the film and a really famous one, was where a group of black protesters marched into the government offices in Selma, and all they did is walk there and ask for the right to vote. Now you might think, how can that be effective? And then when you watch it on the film, you start by thinking even more, how can this be effective? Because what happens is the people march. Martin Luther King is not involved in the march at that time because he's somewhere else. So on the video, it's not got him. But the other people in his group march, and they are met by a group of armed police with batons and tear gas. The police are wearing gas masks, and they tell them to go home, and they don't go home. They just stand there. The protesters don't move, and then they just get attacked, and they get ruthlessly beaten up, very badly beaten. And the film is quite an upsetting scene with kind of horseback policemen hitting people, beating people to the ground, old women, old men. It's a really horrible scene. And so you kind of think, well, how is this effective at all? It doesn't seem to be effective at all. All that's happened is they've protested, nothing's happened, they've got beaten up. However, what's interesting about the film is it really shows effectively how that protest did help the civil rights movement. Because what happens is that protest was televised. It was put on live news around USA, and during the film, as it's filming the protest and the police beating them up and stuff, it keeps cutting away to the reactions of people at home watching it on TV, and the thing it emphasizes is the way that many white people who were watching were horrified by what they saw. They couldn't believe that people were being beaten up. People who were just protesting peacefully for their rights were being beaten up. And so what happened is that peaceful protest changed public opinion for many people about the civil rights movement. It made people think, oh wow, these are just peaceful people trying to get their rights, and they're being beaten up for no reason. And that made a massive difference in the civil rights movement. And then the next protest they have, what's noticeable is it's not just black people on the protest. Many, many white people have joined them, who've seen how bad the situation is and have come to support them. And so it really made a big difference for the civil rights movement. So I want you to have some kind of explanation of what happened at Selma in your notes. And it's just the idea that, well, when he says it's ineffective using violence, what he means is, if he had used violence to protest against the situation in Selma, probably what would have happened is that it would have just turned people against them. If you're in a country where people had racist attitudes, a lot of people have racist attitudes, if they'd seen a really violent protest against these things, it might have just reinforced those attitudes. It might have made people even more prejudiced because they'd have been feeling, well, this group of people are really violent or something like that. Whereas he would have said, if you peacefully protest, then that begins to change people's attitudes. People suddenly think, wow, this group is a really good group of people. They're being treated badly. They suddenly see the police as the bad guys and the protesters as the good guys. That is his idea about how it works. So yeah, need to have in your notes some kind of explanation what happened at Selma and why it could be that peaceful protest can be more effective than non-peaceful, violent protest. Link to that. You might want to link your notes to this. Martin Luther King was influenced by the Hindu teacher Mahatma Gandhi, who we just talked about the salt marches, and Gandhi had a word for this kind of non-violent protest. He called it satyagraha. That is a Sanskrit word. Sanskrit word refers to non-violent resistance, which is designed to change the mind of the people you're opposing by showing them that what they are doing is wrong. So that was what Martin Luther King and what Gandhi had in mind. When Gandhi went on the Salt March, he wanted people to see, oh, these laws are not fair. When Martin Luther King organised that protest in Selma, he wanted people to see, well, this is not a fair situation. So that is satyagraha. Again, it's a Hindu concept because Gandhi is a Hindu, but it was very influential on Martin Luther King's ideas. Okay, let's have a slight look at the other side of things. So yeah, we've looked at reasons to be pacifist, some quotes in favour, some ways you can protest non-violently. We've looked at the idea that it might be more effective, pacifism, than use of violence. However, as you probably are thinking when we were talking through that example of non-violent protest, pacifism is not always effective, and many people would argue that in the case of Martin Luther King's protests, he had a particular reason for being against violence there, which was that there was no way that violence was going to work in his case because, if he had used violence, he'd been fighting against the whole forces of the United States Army and police, which would be a lot more than the civil rights protesters could use. So maybe we could say in Martin Luther King's case, violence wasn't going to be a good answer, but maybe in some other cases it could be a good answer. You might also think, well, yeah, there are some situations when I definitely can't believe that non-violent protest would work. The classic example we always give for war is, what about, was it right for Britain to go to war against Hitler's Germany? Now, in that situation, it's hard to think that non-violent protest or non-violent resistance would have made any difference. Now, here's a good quote from Malcolm X that you can use to oppose pacifism. So Malcolm X, who was a civil rights leader at the same time as Martin Luther King, he also fought for the rights of black Americans at that time. If you watch the film Selma, he's actually featured in the film, and their differences of views are mentioned there. So Malcolm X was not a pacifist and believed that sometimes you had to use violence to bring about change. And here's his famous quote: "Sometimes you have to pick the gun up to put the gun down." So can you write that quote down and make sure you have an explanation? What he's saying is sometimes to stop someone else using violence, to make them put their gun down, you have to pick your gun up. So sometimes you need to use violence to stop other people from using violence against you. And that would probably be the main criticism of pacifism, is that, okay, it's a nice idea. Yes, sometimes it can work, sometimes it can be effective, but sometimes, surely, we have to use violence. In some situations, there's no way we can make a change without using violence. That is all the content. What I do at the end of the lesson usually, and if you've got some revision cards, if you've got those kind of resources with you, you can do this. If not, I'd like you to kind of take a piece of paper and just boil down the essentials on a piece of paper. So make a pacifism revision card, which includes the two kinds of pacifism, that's conditional and absolute, with definitions. One quote from the Bible in favour of pacifism. I would use that quote about turn the other cheek, turn to him the other also, whatever it was. 3 forms of non-violent protest. So 3 things you could do to protest non-violently. Just need to write them down, don't need to have long explanations. Martin Luther King's quote with an explanation of how non-violent protest can be effective. If you can link it to Gandhi's concept of satyagraha, that would be good. And lastly, 1 criticism of pacifism. For me, the best thing to do there would be to put down Malcolm X's quote and explain it. So that's kind of just boiling down everything onto, if you've got those index cards, 1 index card, or maybe like half a side of A4, just so you've got like a little, a little summation of everything we've done on pacifism. Okay, thank you.